Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the survey of Western history that we're doing online this semester. Today, I wanted to take a look at one of the more important aspects of the 16th century and early 17th century, and that is the Age of Discovery. Typically, we refer to this time period as early modern Europe, and the Reformation and the Age of Discovery and the Wars of Religion all feature very prominently in this period. But certainly one of the most important backdrops to the 15th and 16th and early 17th century is the Great Age of Discovery and its impact on European history. Now, I think it's interesting to consider the fact that since the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was more or less a kind of backward entity, confined, as it were, and a relatively poor part of the world. The one effort where the Europeans tried to break out of its borders, of course, was the Crusades. If you remember anything about the Crusades, this is when Europe first went on the offensive, as it were. Now that series of crusades against the Middle East and in Islam in the Middle East was ultimately a failure, but this was one of the first times that Europe actually broke out of its borders. Now in the 15th and 16th centuries, it breaks out of its borders again, and over the next several hundred years comes to rule over large parts of the outside world and to dominate, as it were, the rest. So it seems logical, I think, to ask why this happened and how this happened. Now, I'm going to try to keep my comments here to a rather high level, maybe the 20, 30,000 foot level, if you will. So just keep that in mind, that I'm going to be taking a very cursory and short approach to this, just to kind of highlight some of the key themes. But certainly as we look at the motives for this discovery of the New World, one of those motives was, of course, religious. People like Hernan Cortez or Henry the Navigator, people like that, all had the idea that they were spreading the Christian faith to what they believed was a pagan world. So religion is definitely in the background here. Economics is another one of the motives that is perhaps the most important or the greatest of these motives. Folks like Henry the Navigator of Portugal was also interested in the gold trade, which for centuries had been an Arab monopoly. And they were also interested in the spice trade, the spice markets of India. So, economic motives here are definitely in the background. I also can't help but think that Europeans believed themselves and their culture, even their race, if you will, as something that was superior. And this is an important point to keep in mind. There was a sense of European superiority here that is definitely in the background of these discoveries. In either way, the main question for people who were starting out on these adventures into these new areas, the main question was, what was the shortest way to get to India? What was the shortest way to get where the spices were, to get where the money was? And of course, venturing out into the deep blue sea meant all kinds of scary things might potentially prevent you from getting to your destination. But that was the main thing that people both in Portugal and in Spain wanted to figure out, was how to get to India, where the money was. Now, if you look at the Portuguese, Portugal explored the coast of Africa under Henry the Navigator. Again, the desire was for gold and spices and other forms of wealth, such as slavery. There was lots of money to be made by shipping back things like pepper from India and other spices such as nutmeg or cloves. You have to remember here that Europeans lacked many of the foods that we take for granted. They didn't have rice, they didn't have corn or potatoes, they certainly didn't have Wegmans. They only had a little bit of cheese or butter, Fresh fruits and vegetables were things that they had only in season, almost no sugar. And meat came usually in the fall when they had slaughters. But if you wanted meat at other times, you'd have to kill work animals. And you can imagine what a mangy cow might have tasted like, not too terribly appealing. Their ordinary diet was based largely on bread and gruel, cabbage and turnips, peas, and things like that. So cooking spices were something that were extremely important because they added flavor to stuff that would otherwise taste really, really bad. They also used spices for medicines, they used spices for perfumes, and they also used them in religious ceremonies. So there was this huge demand for spices in Europe. Now, in the past, this trade was dominated by the Turks and the Venetians in Italy. And now Portugal was trying to get their hands into the proverbial pot, if you will. Now, one of the reasons why Portugal was so successful was because they had a powerful military and naval force. They had ships. So this is something that made them or helped them to be successful in this venture. The Spanish, on the other hand, set sail to the west, thinking that this was the shorter way to get to India, to where all the stuff was. And of course, this is where we encounter someone like Christopher Columbus, whose voyage of 1492 began what was to be really more than 3 centuries of Spanish conquest and exploitation of the Americas. Columbus, as you probably know, was an Italian, but he was sponsored by the Spanish on these voyages. And the gold and the silver that would return into Spanish treasuries would really help Spain to become one of the leading powers in Europe in the 16th century. And one of the things that I want you to pick up on here as you think about what's going on in this time period is the competition that is quickly developing here among these European states. Columbus mistakenly thought that he had landed in the West Indies and called the native people Indians. He actually landed in San Salvador in the Caribbean and in Cuba and what is today Haiti. Now, there were others who followed Columbus, and they encountered 2 major people groups, the Aztecs of Mexico and the Incas of Peru. In 1519, Hernan Cortez landed on the coast of Mexico with about 500 or 600 men. He opened up communication with tribes nearby and then with Montezuma. By 1521, he had defeated the Aztecs and proclaimed it to be the New Spain. Now, obviously, religious motivation was behind some of this, as I mentioned earlier, but more importantly, he wanted their gold. What is definitely clear from Cortez's involvement here among the Aztecs is that the indigenous population of Mexico fell from roughly 25 million in 1520 to perhaps as little as 1 million in 1600. Europeans, of course, brought with them their diseases, things like typhus and smallpox, and this killed off a huge part of the population in these native territories. In 1531, Francisco Pizarro sailed from Panama and landed on the western coast of the South American continent to undertake a campaign against the Incas. And his force included about 100 men, and like Cortez, he slaughtered thousands of Indians. These were some of the most brutal stories in Western history. And as you can imagine, just by looking at some of the woodcuts of the time, the Indians didn't always lay down politely. You can see in some of these images here examples of cannibalism. You can see in the upper image here where a person who appears to be a monk, actually, because of his shaved head, called a tonsure, is actually dismembered. Or the image on the left in the circle where somebody appears to be eating an arm. So the stories here were pretty brutal and pretty horrific, and these were fed back into European civilizations, European populations, to kind of help communicate how brutal these savage people were. Now, Pizarro and his crowd conquered these people to use as labor in digging for gold. Mining was one of the main economic activities of the Spanish. But it would take a single person quite a long time to extract gold from streams. So the idea was to use these native Indians as forced labor. Now, I think that one of the questions we have to ask is, why was this move made by the Spanish and Portuguese and not the French or the English? Well, a couple of things to consider here. The Portuguese really had no other outlet in Europe, so it was kind of natural for them to turn to the west coast of Africa in order to find that outlet. Spain, on the other hand, is a bit different. Usually when Spain was interested in expanding militarily or economically, it turned its attention to Italy. But the Spanish were also, we have to remember, conquerors of the Moors, or Muslims, in Granada. And I think we need to appreciate here that the conquistadors, who are conquering much of Central and South America, were also the relatives of the men who fought against Moorish or Muslim infidels. So maybe that explains a little bit as to why it was that the Spanish and Portuguese did this as opposed to the English or French. Maybe it's just something that was part of their makeup. Now, I think it's important to take a look here at some of the consequences of this expansion. Probably the most immediate effects of the overseas voyages and conquests was economic. By the beginning of the 16th century, the Portuguese had literally broken the Venetian monopoly for the spice trade from India to Europe. And this was a huge blow, and it sparked a massive competition here between the Venetians in Italy and the Portuguese. And when the Dutch and also the English get in on this, the Venetians were literally put out of business. Now, the discovery of the Americas also had some economic consequences for the Spanish. For one thing, this brought a wealth of new imports into Europe. The early conquistadors were interested primarily in gold, but by the middle of the 16th century, silver mining was the chief source of wealth. And estimates suggest that somewhere around 1.5 million ounces of silver a year were pouring into Europe. And by the end of the century, somewhere around 10 million ounces per year. So one of the other consequences of this expansion is going to relate to inflation. The influx of these precious metals and spices into Europe, it kind of had a mixed blessing. In the 16th century, because of the rise in population and the increased quantities of gold and silver bullion that was now in circulation, the price of goods rose considerably. I mean, just think about this, more population, more gold, more goods, creates this greater demand. And as the demand increases, of course, the prices go up. So whenever you have more people, there's always this need for land and for food and for goods. So food prices literally quadrupled in the course of the century. Rents on land increased, and the evidence that we have here is rather complete. We have sermons, for example, against landlords and people who raised these rents. We have a number of 16th century handbooks which instruct landowners how to squeeze every last nickel out of their tenants. It's not unlike the kinds of things that we see today between landlords and tenants. In Spain, it was even worse, but other countries of Europe also felt the crunch. And this is also the context for such things as the peasant revolts, in particular the one in Germany in the 16th century, and even the Dutch revolt in the 16th and 17th centuries. So remember that in this time period, in the 16th and 17th centuries, religion is definitely in the foreground of concern. People are still wrestling with typical Protestant and Catholic concerns. But I want to emphasize here that economic factors are also very, very much in the background. As industrial capitalism begins to take off, there's this great separation that exists between the rich and the poor. So in spite of the expanding markets and in spite of the way in which prices began to rise during this period, the standard of living for most people really didn't change. Now that's the downside of all of this. The upside, as I suppose you could call it, is this did feed the European economy. And throughout the 16th century, Europe experienced huge economic growth, which in turn influenced things like industrial production and manufacturing and, of course, banking. Great land estates produced things like potatoes and sugar. They produced tobacco. These were all things that the Europeans craved. The Spaniards had to import much of the goods for the colonists in America, and they paid for these goods with silver imported from the New World. So there's this huge economic stimulus going on in Europe. That's a really important thing to keep in mind here. And what this did was really shift the economic center of Europe from the old days where it was in the Mediterranean. And here again, the Venetians, I point to Venice, places like Venice. You see this shift away from the economic center of Europe from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic seaboard. Now, another consequence that we should keep in mind here is the psychological element that's going on in the background. It took a long time for these discoveries to sink in, but both the Portuguese and the Spanish met organized states and developed religions. And the Portuguese basically met Islamic civilizations, and so the solution was kind of obvious with regard to them. That was, you conquer them. Okay, that's what the Europeans did when it came to dealing with Islam, was they conquered it. This was, in a way, this is like the Crusades all over again. And when the Pope granted the Portuguese the eastern discovered territories, they were quite willing to consent to this. The Spanish, on the other hand, encountered unknown people that they assumed were pagan and infidels with strange political and social organizations and customs. And the question was, who were these American Indians? Were they beasts? Were they men? Or were they something in between? And this sense of, as I mentioned earlier, this sense of superiority gave the Spanish what they believed to be the right to take away their land. So these questions fed into the traditional conceptions of the then known world. European centrism, the relationship between Christianity and paganism, and Christianity and Islam. So this Eurocentrism was definitely something that was in the background here. And this is the first time, really, that these Europeans are faced with civilizations that are much different from their own. And it raised all sorts of questions that would dominate the intellectual environment in the coming years. Now, there were a couple of other problems as well. One of which was a labor issue. All of this exploitation and economic activity required labor. And the Spanish decided that the Indian population would provide that labor. And when Indian labor was not enough, black slavery was enforced in the New World. And both the Spanish and the Portuguese used African slaves in Europe. They were used also in Latin America. and on the sugar plantations of the West Indies. And one final thing to keep in mind here with regard to the consequences was the extinction or the attempted extinction of native populations. The natives were subjects of Queen Isabella and were supposed to be protected. But the queen, of course, was a very long way away. And new diseases wiped out somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of these populations. I mentioned this earlier, but diseases like smallpox and typhus decimated these native civilizations. Now, it is important to keep in mind that this easy conquering of the New World would lead to, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of Eurocentrism that had many downsides, but also would be expanded and strengthened when you combine these discoveries with the scientific revolution that's taking place here, as well as the Enlightenment, and even later into the modern period, 19th century imperialism. So again, this is a really, really important period that has profound ramifications for the subsequent history of Europe and its relationship to the rest of the world. Now, in the wake of these economic changes, the merchant is also another figure that arose as an important figure in early modern society. Now, when you think about merchants, these aren't merchants in the modern sense. So these aren't retailers like what we see today. Rather, they were money changers. They were bankers. They were international bankers, and they were industrialists. They were often involved in things like overseas trade and even served as insurance brokers. Now, most of the time, at least in the 16th century, these were office workers in charge of a huge economic machine. But it gets extremely complicated here when you begin to see a kind of marriage that exists between this new nobility of merchants and the crown, and particularly as governments refuse to repay their debts and cause a lot of these bankers, international bankers, to go belly up. So this age of discovery has important ramifications for the subsequent history of European civilization. It highlights the competition that begins to develop between these European countries. It highlights the aggression that we see with other native populations that for the first time come into purview among the Europeans. And it also highlights a number of the questions that Europeans are going to be raising as they face this world that is suddenly looking much more complex and much more different than they had ever seen before. So that's what I wanted to say about the so-called age of discovery in the early modern period. Please post any questions or comments that you have about any of this in the Slack channel. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking with you next time.